My name is Nadia Rubai. I am one of the co-directors of the Institute for Genocide and Mass Atrocity Prevention. If you're not already familiar with that institute at Binghamton University, one of the things that we do is we try to connect the academic world with the world of practice, so that this study of atrocity prevention is not just something theoretical, it is actually something very practical that is on the ground and occurring in many ways, shapes, and forms by people all over the world. Before we go any further, I want to acknowledge that Binghamton University sits on the ancestral lands of the Haudenosaunee people, specifically the Oneida and Onondaga. And then I'm speaking to you from the lands of another group of Haudenosaunee, the Cayuga. And we like to start with those types of land acknowledgements with IG map events or institute events to acknowledge that we are privileged, the privileges that we have, we're experiencing because other people, in part as a result of suffering that other people have had in the past. And that those land disputes are often defined as if they're about land, but they're actually about people. They're about people's lives. They have real impacts on people's lives and the cultures. And so those conflicts are important for us to acknowledge. And what we have the advantage, the opportunity to do this week with these events coordinated with the Parent Circle Family Forum is to look at the creative and very personal ways that people are working to dismantle systems of hate and dehumanization, how they are addressing those issues at an individual level and how that can have a wider impact. We're looking to use these events this week to learn more about the situation in Israel and Palestine, and to look for lessons that we can apply in other contexts as ways to build societal resilience, to promote peace, to reduce risks of mass violence, and to improve a general sense of humanity in the face of so much dehumanization. So for those, I know some people here have been part of some of the earlier events this week. You may have heard Rami speak on Monday. You may have watched a video in which he was featured, a documentary film on Tuesday. You may have been part of some of the events yesterday. Today we are joined, I hope we're joined by at least one, but hopefully two individuals who are also going to share their stories of loss and their stories of reconciliation. And in this case, so I'm going to introduce very briefly Yig'al Elhanan, who also happens to be Rami's son. So if you listen to Rami and Bassam on Monday, this is an opportunity to hear from their sons, but as in their own right, their experiences of loss and reconciliation. Because we provided brief bios in the registration materials, I'm not going to repeat those for you, and I think their stories are best told in their own words. So I am going to turn things over to Yig'al. I'm going to suggest that for those of you who are here that you keep your video on, but you may want to switch to speaker view or presenter view, so that you can actually see Yig'al and it's not in a sea of faces. And then when we return to discussion after that, we will have opportunity for questions and answers after that. We'll go from there. So Yig'al?
Thank you so much, Nadia, and thank you everyone for being here and hearing and going to hear our stories. Nadia, I think it will be best, although I will try to represent my brother Caramin to the best of my ability. I think maybe so we'll have a possibility to hear him in his own voice. We can start with the video and then get back to the stories.
Absolutely. Would you like me to have either the video just of him or the video of the two of you? I could do.
So I think maybe the video of just of him, and then we'll move on.
One moment. And get that ready. Okay. All right, so I'm going to share my screen.
I heard him.
بالأمس كنت ذكيا.
He's here.
لذلك أردت تغيير.
No, it's the video that we hear. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry.
لذلك أنا أغير نفسي.
Hold on. Let me stop that and share the screen first. Thanks for your patience with my technology. All right, here we go.
بالأمس كنت ذكيا لذلك أردت تغيير العالم. اليوم أصبحت حكيما لذلك أنا أغير نفسي. إن العمل على تغيير الواقع الفاسد إلى واقع أفضل لن يحدث بالتمني، وإنما بالعمل المتواصل لأصحاب الهمم العالية والإرادة الصلبة. لكن الخطوة الأولى هي ابدأ بنفسك قبل أن تغير الآخرين. عندما كنت في 12 من عمري وجدت نفسي مشاركاً في لقاءات حركة جديدة تسمى مقاتلون من أجل السلام. لا أعرف عنها شيئاً ولم أفهم في حينها هدف هذه الحركة، ولم يكن لي خيار في ذلك. كنت أذهب برفقة والدي بسام عرامين، ولم أكن أدرك اصطحابه لي في اللقاءات مع الإسرائيليين. لم أفهم لغتهم، وبعد سنة تقريبا وجدت نفسي مشاركا في لقاءات منظمة أخرى، وهي منتدى العائلات الثكلى المشترك، وذلك بعد مقتل شقيقتي عبير وهي في 10 من عمرها برصاصة جندي إسرائيلي، بعدما خرجت لاستراحة خلال دراستها في المدرسة في عام 16/1/2007. وأيضاً لم يكن لي خيار في ذلك. فالرصاصة التي وضعت حد لحياة وأحلام عبير يبدو أن لا خيار لها إلا الوصول للهدف، وهو رأس عبير. والبندقية أيضاً بلا خيار إلا تنفيذ الأوامر. والجندي أيضاً كان ضحية لتاريخ طويل من صنع الخوف، فالكل ضحية، لكن الضحية الكبرى كانت عبير. خلال السنوات القادمة واجهت تحديات كبيرة وصعبة، من مشاعر القهر والغضب والرغبة الشديدة في الانتقام. ليس بسهولة وجدت لي مكان في اللقاءات التي أخذت إليها، لكن مع الوقت وجدت النور الذي أضاء لي الطريق. إنه النور الذي أنعم الله به علي بواسطة إنسان تعجز كل الكلمات عن وصف إنسانيته. إنه والدي بسام، هذا المقاتل الصلب الذي أمضى 7 سنوات في السجون الإسرائيلية، هو الذي علمني التسامي على الماضي والانطلاق دائما نحو الحياة. فقد انتصر على السجان من خلال تمسكه بابتسامته المعتادة وهدوئه الهادر وشموخه الصارخ وتواضعه الدائم. علمني أنني لست قاتلاً، والانتقام هو طريق الضعفاء والجبناء. نحن لا ننتقم، نحن نقاوم من أجل هدف نبيل، نقاوم من أجل الحياة وليس من أجل الموت. خلال السنوات الطويلة علمت بوجود شراكة قوية بين والدي ورامي الحنان والد سمدار، لكن لم أشعر بأنني جزءاً من هذه الشراكة، وأيضاً لم أعرف يجال أخ سمدار الحنان. واليوم إن عضويتي التي أفتخر بها حركة مقاتلون من أجل السلام ومنتدى العائلات الثكلى هو خياري أنا، وأتشرف بتمثيلهم والعمل معهم برفقة عدو السابق صديقي وشريكي الحالي يجال. السادة الحضور، إن العقبة الوحيدة التي تقف أمام الشعبين هي الاحتلال الإسرائيلي الذي هو مصدر العنف والتطرف وسفك الدماء. فالاحتلال جعل حياتنا جحيماً لا يطاق. الموت يتربص بنا عند كل حاجز عسكري. الاعتقالات والإهانات اليومية أصبحت أسماؤنا ولون بشرتنا وجنسيتنا ولغتنا لعنة وتهمة جنائية نعاقب عليها. وهنا أقول لحكام إسرائيل إن سياسة الاستمرار في قمع الشعب الفلسطيني لن يجلب لكم الأمن. وهنا أدعوكم أن ترفعوا بنادقكم عن أحلامنا، أطفالنا، شوارعنا، رياضتنا، الماء والهواء. لا تقتلوا الأمل فينا. وفي الختام، أنا ويجال سنستمر في طريق والدانا، وكما كان يردد والدي دائما: نحن لا نتحدث عن السلام، بل نحن نصنع السلام. لذلك قررنا مقاتلون من أجل السلام ومنتدى العائلات أننا لن نستسلم أبداً، وسنواصل الكفاح حتى يتحقق السلام. الانتقام الوحيد لدماء عبير عرامين وسمدار الحنان هو صنع السلام. وشكراً.
Yigal?
Okay, Nadia, should I start?
Yes, please.
So thanks again. Good thing we started with Arab's speech alone, because you're going to have enough of me for the next hour. I would like to start with one of the most important points that Arab, my brother, said in his speech, that this work, and some of you have heard my father and Bassam a few days ago, is for us is to continue in the path of our fathers, who are the original or true evolutionaries in the concept of bereaved families, Palestinians and Israelis meeting together. And for us, it's a huge honor. For me, it's a huge honor, and I'm a bit excited because you guys are here, and of course, my father is right amongst you. I was born on the 6th of September 1992 in West Jerusalem. Up to a certain point in my life, because of reasons that differ from segregation between Jewish and Palestinian communities in Jerusalem, and I'm not using this word lightly to an American audience, and to socioeconomical and class differences. For me, Palestinians were nothing else but this ambiguous, scary kind of other kind of conglomerate living on the other side of the #1 road in Jerusalem. Jerusalem, just to say, it's a city of almost 1 million people. 350,000 of them are Palestinians. But for me, growing up in Jerusalem, there was no kind of connection whatsoever, and it is not by chance. Palestinians for me were people that could have, put gas in my parents' car or built the houses around our home. Storyless, faceless people. That reality changed for me completely, 180 degrees. 2 days before my 5th birthday, on the 4th of September, 1997, 5 girls from the Gimnasia Ivrit High School in the city center of Jerusalem left the school in the middle of the school day. They told their parents and their teachers they're going to buy textbooks. Probably they planned on doing something a little bit more fun than that, skipping school in the beginning of the school year. That group met with another group of 3 people, 3 very desperate, very angry, probably vengeful, as the statistics teach us. Palestinians that came out from a refugee camp near the city of Nablus, wearing to their bodies detonation belts and grenades. These 2 parties met in Ben Yehuda Street in the city center of Jerusalem. In the suicide bombing, 7 people were killed, 3 Palestinian bombers and 4 Israeli civilians. Yael Botwin was killed instantly. Sivan Zarka, another one of the girls, was killed instantly. Daniela Birman, he's still rehabilitating from a very, very severe brain injury over almost now 24 years later. My sister, Smadar Elhanan, was killed instantly from a shrapnel of the bomb that hit her in the back of the head, and another Israeli young man. Now, before we will get into the political context, and we will, because this story has a political context, only the only context it has, I would like to invite you to have a short glimpse, to try and imagine, and I hope no one here has experienced such an experience, to the heart of a family which loses a loved one violently, abruptly. I would like you to imagine a body that is all of a sudden missing an essential organ or limb, something internal, or an arm, a leg, something that you will always feel its absence and that will never grow back, and that will define the rest of your life. And this was most certainly the case for us. My family, shortly after the bombing, joined the Parent Circle in 1999. They had political background beforehand, an activist political background. My mother was active in an organization called For Mothers, who advocated for the withdrawal of the IDF from southern Lebanon, which my older brothers served in the IDF in Lebanon, one of them at the time. My grandfather has his own political story, but for me, it was a whole different reality. Most of the political activity I did at the age of 5 was, building settlements in the sandbox of my kindergarten, nothing more than that. And after Smadar's death, I took it to heart, and I had this feeling, which was quite different from my family's approach, from my father's approach, from my mother's approach, that has nothing to do with anyone. This is our own personal tragedy. Smadar was killed. That's it. And this is something that we need to deal in our own intimate family cell. This is our own personal trauma. And with this feeling, I grew up during the Second Intifada in Jerusalem, the Al-Aqsa Intifada, a series of Palestinian attacks inside civil population in Israel, and of course, during the ongoing occupation, Israeli occupation of over Palestine and Palestinians. We lived near the city center of Jerusalem, the sound of the bombings, if you ask 3 people from Jerusalem that grew up around the same period, the conversation will always lead quite shortly to how many times have you been near to a suicide bombing and didn't die? And this is something casual, And with this burden, I carried on, again, not connecting the dots, being angry at my parents who are connecting the dots the way that they did. And this, how come you need to be always against everything? How come you need always to be, so critical about our country, about what we're doing, etc. And I think I came to understand this important approach or view of the world and the necessity of being active against it in 2 different occasions. The first one, and here it's for me a good opportunity to embarrass my father, was when I was around 8 years old. When I was 8 years old, it was the middle of the Second Intifada, the middle of Operation Protective Wall, I think it's the translation into English, which was the occupation, the reoccupation of the West Bank after the withdrawal of the IDF, the so-called withdrawal after the Oslo Accord. The IDF in the 2000s reoccupied the West Bank in a very, very bloody campaign, over 1 million bullets shot in the refugee camp of Jenin alone. Many casualties, many house demolitions, vineyards demolitions, orchard demolitions inside the West Bank, Palestinian orchards and vineyards. And my father showed me a picture that was quite famous at the time, of an old Palestinian man inside his field, standing in front of an Israeli IDF D9 bulldozer, and he asked me, Yigal, which one is stronger? Which one of those 2 figures in the picture? Being not a very sophisticated child, I answered the correct answer, physically speaking, of course, the D9. And then my father told me, no, I think it's that man opposite, standing in front of that thing. And this is something that I carried with me. I think the second time that these dots connected for me, when I was 14 years old, it was the age that Smadar was when she was killed, which is naturally an age you ask yourself a lot of questions, some better than others. But one of the good questions I asked was why? Why here? What happened? What's the background? What happened to my family? Why it needed to happen to us? And I went online. And I learned a figure that back then shook my world, and I hope will shake yours as well. In 1996, 1 year before Smadar was killed, Benjamin Netanyahu, our current emperor, prime minister, came to power for the first time. In one of his most flamboyant and cocky, if I might say, speeches from 2003, Benjamin Netanyahu says that there were only 3 suicide attacks inside the Green Line during his first time in office. One of those attacks is our attack. And between 96 and 99, 220 people lost their lives between the Jordan River and the sea. This is not including southern Lebanon that I mentioned. That means 100 Israelis and 120 Palestinians that have joined the dysfunctional family that both Arab and myself are part of, the family of the bereaved. That number, added to the fact that Palestinians were no longer this faceless, ambiguous thing for me. By that time, I was part of the youth activities of the Parent Circle. I had Palestinian friends, I had Palestinian peers. I met Urud Abu Awad, who lost her uncle. I met Mohammed El-Baw, who lost his brother Firas. I met many other of the 300 Palestinian members that we have in the parent circle. And I've been to the West Bank. I've realized this reality. You know, these two facts together made me understand that, you know, this is not something written from above. This is not a singular case that chance made it happen so that my sister was there during the bombing. This was a reality of political decisions made by men and women, just like ourselves, in order to gain political currency. Now, what Benjamin Netanyahu failed to recognize in his speech from 2003 was that during one of his first things that he did when he came to office was opening the Kotel tunnels. The Kotel tunnels are tunnels that go underneath the Western Wall, underneath Temple Mount, Haram Sharif, one of the most sensitive and delicate places in the world, and was certainly the most sensitive and delicate place in Israel and Palestine. And as retaliation, although he was advised against it, but by all security branches, the retaliation to the opening of the Kotel tunnels was a very violent and big outbreak of violence, which resulted again in one of those 3 attacks that changed my life. I think the second time that I've met Smadar's death in a political context, and I think that was the time that made me realize that I need to take an active part against the occupation and against the injustice, was before I joined the Israeli army. I was a soldier between 2011 and 2014. I wasn't a combatant soldier because bereaved families in Israel, the parents need to sign a legal document, and luckily my parents did not agree to sign that document. And before I joined, I was part of, I was a youth counselor in one of our summer camps. We hold every year a summer camp for bereaved Israeli and Palestinian children. This year it was via Zoom, unfortunately, but Arab and myself were the managers of this camp. And after, being a counselor at the camp and a few days before joining the army, I had a real salad in my head. I had a big dilemma in my hands. And first, I thought about refusing to join the Israeli army, to become a conscientious objector, like many of the young heroes and heroines that we have every year that are quite silenced by the mainstream media. But on the other hand, I wanted to be part of my society, and this is something that we need to look at. I think if you want to understand participation of mostly young men and Israeli men and women inside the mechanisms of the conflict, is that after being 12 years in an Israeli public education system, the one thing that you believe will make you be part of your society, will make you contribute to your society, will make you an essential potential leader of the society, is to join the Israeli army. This is, let's say, an equivalent, if we're talking about social mechanisms, of college in the USA, something that will determine how much you'll be part of the society after you do it. So with this dilemma, I went around a week or two before I joined the army, and we came to sit, a few friends from the parent circle, some Palestinian members of the parent circle, some Jewish members of the parent circle, my father included, my brothers, sitting in Bejala. Bejala is an Area C, one of the only areas that Palestinians and Israeli Jews can meet without having to fear being persecuted by the government if you enter a territory which is controlled by Palestinian Authority. You risk yourself, this is rarely enforced on Jews, but you risk being put up to 3 years in jail and paying $50,000 fine, which is a little bit over $10,000. So Area C, which is a result of the Oslo Accord, is one of those places. we can meet. Sitting there, one of the Palestinian members of the parent circle, I talked, about what's had to happen and the dilemmas, etc. And one of the Palestinian members of the parent circle told me something that I will never forget. He told me, Yig'al, I love you like family. I love you like a son. We were truly very, very, very close. But once you're going to put on their uniform, I will stop speaking to you. Now, at the time, it offended me deeply. I wanted to get up and tell him, how can you say that? You know the dilemma, you know where I come from, etc., etc. But back then I had some tact left. I didn't do that, but I carried this with me. Now, in the army, I was part of the education corps, which is a topic for a whole different lecture if you want to talk about militarized society topics. I worked in a school in one of Jerusalem's Jewish low socioeconomical neighborhoods bordering the eastern part of the city where Palestinians live, in the neighborhood of Armon HaNatziv, which is bordered by Jabal Mukaber and Sur Baher, which one of those neighborhoods is also a refugee camp. Now I worked there in a Jewish school with the kids, what we call education to values, which by definition, my job was to encourage them to join the Israeli army. I did something a little bit different than that though. And close to the end of my service, I went onto the bus, I put on my headphones, I had my uniforms on. I didn't really want to speak to anyone. It was a long day, but with me to the bus came on a 17-year-old Palestinian boy. Now, we didn't speak, but we didn't need to. I don't know his name, I don't know where he's from, but the way that he looked at me told me everything. He told me exactly the story of that sentence that the dear friend told me 3 years beforehand. He looked at me the only way possible for young Palestinians to look at young Israelis, giving this current power balance and political situation. He looked at me as his oppressor. He looked at me as his occupier. He looked at me as a soldier that might have obtained his family at the checkpoint a few hours the day before. He looked at me as the soldier that might have entered his house. He looked at me as a soldier that might have taken him into custody with no trial and no not appear in front of a judge without any kind of due process. And that made me realize the grave part that young Israelis take upon themselves in this conflict, sometimes unknowingly, sometimes out of the pure agenda or thought that in order to be part of the society, this is what we need to do, and the military has this kind of neutral feel to it, but there's nothing neutral about it. After that experience, I decided I will no longer be looked upon as a symbol of anything, but if I must, I will be looked on as a symbol of persistent, fierce struggle against the occupation and for justice in Israel and Palestine. I was discharged from the military, and I joined the parent circle as an active member, but this time as a young man and other organizations, and this is what I generally also do in my life. Now, this is the story that led me to become active in this kind of field of work, and I think looking at the time, maybe it will also be a good time now to open it for questions. And then maybe if Arab will join a bit later, he'll also have some time to say something. Okay?
Thank you, Yig'al. Thanks so much for sharing that story. I'm going to give students an opportunity in particular, but everyone is welcome to ask questions. Please use the raise hand function because otherwise we can't see you all. We have to go through 3 screens to see things, but I'm going to take the liberty of making a comment more so than a question, because the last point that you just made about this young Palestinian, getting on the bus, looking at you, and your words were looking at you in the only way that he could, as his oppressor, as his occupier. It really struck home, I think, in the context of the United States. One of the privileges that white people have is often to look at conflicts around race, or to look at Black Americans who are criticized for framing everything in terms of being a racial issue. And you often hear white people saying, you know, it's not always about race. Why do they always have to make it about race? And I think you really drove home the point of it's not a choice. It actually is the only way to look at things. Either you are a symbol and a part of being the oppressor, or you have to be actively involved in trying to change that. Is kind of that transition that you made. And part of that is taking off the uniform, but part of that is also in the way you live your life. And I think that's a really powerful an analogy that you gave in your context that has very direct applicability to the US current context as well. So I just wanted to thank you for sharing that in those terms.
Thank you, Nadia. I'll take what you say and use it a little bit also. You know, Arab in our joint lectures usually quotes Martin Luther King Jr. By saying that the thing that we will remember is the silence of our friends, and not the actions of our enemies, and not what our allies did. Of course, I'm paraphrasing. He's the one with the quotes, and he has them good and all packed up. And this is something that we need to realize about joint activism against the occupation in general. Now, I'm sitting here in front of you in a relative, you know, I live currently in Haifa, which is a city in the northern Israel. I have a free life. I can move wherever I want. I have all the privileges that the Jewish citizen in Israel has. I feel like the majority. Every political party will talk about the things that I'm interested in, that are interesting to my life. But Palestinians do not have this privilege, and do not have the privilege at all. They don't have this privilege also being Israeli civilians living inside the 1948 borders, being marginalized and discriminated against in terms of budget and policy. And furthermore, living under military rule in the West Bank, where freedom of movement is not something that you have, freedom of occupation, freedom to education, almost every human right, you know, that we can, or I can think of something that is completely, nothing. This is ordinary, this is how I live my life. My Palestinian party does not have that. And this is something very interesting to understand about joint activism against occupation and for justice. There is no symmetry. They cannot be symmetry. Arab is a hero. Arab is transcending above the very, very severe and heavy circumstances of life, adding to that being a bereaved brother, and decides to come every day and work with me. Now, this is a humbling experience for me, but it's also something very, very interesting to understand in the sense that we're talking about a place that the reality of this place creates, of course, the destruction and the death that I am, beside other things, also a victim of. But we live in a place that has one ruling system. Some of the people that live under that system have certain rights, and the others have none. And this is something that is important to say here before we dive into anything else. And I think this is also, if I might add, what is so important about the Parent Circle and organizations like us. There's no organization like us, I think, worldwide, of bringing bereaved people that are in conflict as we speak, but let's say Combatants for Peace, Ta'ayush, other organizations that bring Palestinian and Jews to work together against occupation. The radical approach here is not from our side, the Jewish side that comes, and we want to fix this because this ruins our country as well. But the radical approach is from our Palestinian partners, that's saying, despite everything, we are still willing to work with you. And this is something that we need to say thank you about every day that is happening.
Shukran. What questions do people have? Elizabeth, you can go ahead and unmute yourself.
First of all, I just wanted to thank you for sharing your and Arab's story. I thought that it was so inspiring and eye-opening to listen to. And my question is, if you are confronted with hatred about your views about creating this peaceful dialogue between Israelis and Palestinians by your friends or even by people you've lectured before who hold very opposing opinions to you. And I don't know if you could speak on behalf of Arab, but I was wondering if he's experienced any hatred from his Palestinian friends or family members or people he's lectured on the views he's hold for like almost betraying, if you would say, like his friends and family. And the same question kind of applies to you of this like maybe like betraying attitude that your views may hold.
Thank you. First of all, I choose my friends carefully. So on that part, everything's okay. But second, unfortunately, yes. I must say, I've been to the West Bank. I'm going. I've been around. I never faced any kind of, violence, or I didn't feel afraid in any house that I've been in. But in the streets of Tel Aviv, protesting the bombing in Gaza, I was, chased down, and people tried to hurt me physically. So this is something to teach us also about, let's say, the meaning of the occupation inside Jewish Israeli society, that everything is escalating and very, very, very quickly. I think it happens in the whole world. I don't need to tell you this, living in the States. Only today I read in the news that an ultra-Orthodox family was attacked by knife point in Central Park, racism and shootings and against anyone who is not, didn't look like your former president and your current president, in fact. But, and this is something very important to say, for instance, and I'm sure maybe the last lectures talked about it, but the Parents Circle, together with Combatants for Peace, hold every year a joint memorial service. This is the speech that you saw Arab speaking at the beginning is from there. We hold a joint memorial service in the day that is traditionally we state the Remembrance Day for Israeli casualties of terrorist attacks and people who died in war, soldiers. And we decided to hold a joint ceremony. Now, the first joint ceremony in 2007 had 400 people in a fringe theater in Tel Aviv. The last ceremony had over 200,000 views online. It was via Zoom, and the one before that had 7,000 people. The one that we spoke at in 2016 had 5,000 people. This is growing exponentially, like the coronavirus cases. It grows the same. Now, if we're talking about points of hope inside our society and inside both of the societies, this is one of them. One of the ceremonies in 2017, the Israeli defense minister, and they're doing the same kind of stunts every year since then, banned the entrance of our Palestinian activists to the ceremony. So we decided to hold a parallel ceremony inside the West Bank in Bejala. Now, I went to that ceremony. I went off the bus and I saw 700 people, mostly Palestinians, coming to remember the death of also Jewish deads in this conflict together with me, but in the West Bank. Okay? Now, this is something that, if you think about it for a second, it's almost incomprehensible. There's no reason for them to do that. If I was in their steps, in their shoes, I don't know if this is what I would have done. But the images of solidarity and the potential of joint society between the Jordan River and the sea are evident every day. So we have, on one hand, the process of fascization, escalation in violence. It is less safe to speak your views out loud. You will be called a traitor, etc. But on the other hand, in those kind of activities, little pockets of hope, we are able to remember the glorious past that Jews and Arabs had in this region, if we're talking before Zionism. I'm a student of history. This is what I do. This is the topic also that I'm interested in. And the hostility between us is imported. We brought it here from Europe. there was never a there was never a situation, except, specific cases, of course. But in general, there was never a situation in this region that Jews and Muslims and Christians didn't feel that they can live together. Now, inshallah, this will happen again sometime soon. I hope I answered the question.
That's right for others to raise their hands. The point you just made, Yigala, is really important. Sometimes we talk about the inappropriateness of the term reconciliation, and that we need to talk about just conciliation, because there never was a time before when there were good relations. But in this case, there actually was. If we go back far enough, maybe not in the memories of certainly not in the memories of anyone who's alive now, but the original history is of peaceful coexistence and having a common background that is not grounded in hate. And so I think that is also a promising connection that can be made. We've got a lot of students. I know students are sometimes hesitant to join in and ask questions, but please do. Also, our other guests. Julia, go ahead.
Okay, so bear with me. I'm still trying to compose this in my head, but in America and with American Jews, I feel like so many perceive anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism, and often it can be conflated with that as the rhetoric used in the States. How would you go about talking to a person who so strongly believes in Zionism because of the anti-Semitism that they've experienced?
I won't tell anybody that they don't have the right for self-determination. I will not tell anybody that they don't have the right of having their own country, fulfilling their national goals, etc., etc., etc. But I think one of the biggest grievances and sins Zionism and the State of Israel did to the Jewry of the world is to make Zionism, which is a political method that you can argue about, and you can say it's a good method, it's not a good method, it has its prices, it has anyway. And they made Zionism parallel, if not the same, to Judaism in general. It means that being Jewish, of course you're a Zionist. Well, I say no. I'm a Jewish, I'm not Zionist. I live in Israel, I'm not Zionist. And stating that, now I know it's also a big debate inside American Jewry, whether Jews, wherever they are accountable for the deeds of the State of Israel, even if they didn't haven't been here, never in their life. Now I know it's a big debate, and this is your debate. You can have it to yourself. But I must say that from here, where I stand, is that US dollars pay for the bullets that are amputating legs on the border in Gaza. US dollars are paying for the bombs that have been dropped in Gaza. US dollars have been paying for the wall, the apartheid wall that we've been building in the West Bank. The entrenchment of US interests in this conflict, economic and otherwise, is so deep that I don't think anybody that their taxes are paying for this, my taxes as well, of course, have the privilege of being silent. Remember the silence of our friends. And this is here, I'm paraphrasing my father, that says, my grandfather, was an Auschwitz survivor. He used to call himself an Auschwitz graduate. Now, the US didn't get involved in the war up to 1942, up to the point where many, 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 many Jews and other marginalized communities of Europe were already lost. Now, the world has its history of being bystanders. Being a bystander towards any kind of injustice, even more so if this injustice is being carried out by your name, and this is something that, if I'm thinking about myself in your shoes, this is the huge reason to be outraged. This is done by your name. You have nothing to do with it, maybe, but it's done by your name. You don't have the privilege to stand, to be a bystander in this kind of topics. And I think towards any injustice, you know, we can say the same thing about Yemen. We can say the same thing about what happened in Syria, what happens in Syria. We can say the world is in turmoil due to the current power balance, which we are all part of. And this is not something that we can reject from us, in my opinion.
And so the next handout I see is actually from one of our faculty members, Kent Scholl from the Department of History.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Yigao. Thank you to IGMAP for hosting this and making it coincide with our class. I'm teaching a class right now on forced migration in the Middle East from the 19th through the 20th centuries to the present. And one of the things we're looking at is trying to bring these different punctuated, often focused on punctuated types of displacement, forced displacement of people together to look at the systemic problems and to focus on realizing the humanity that's going on. And so, Yigao, thank you very much for what you've shared and your focus. One question I would like to have you address, if you can, is this, and you have in some part, but to address a little bit more or comment on it, is this continued forced displacement of populations and people on a systemic scale, particularly against Palestinians, but also what has been done to Jews to be able to talk about this in the same space in some ways, recognizing the power dynamics and the imbalance. So thank you very much, Yigao.
Well, that's a complicated question. And
I'm sorry.
Since you're an historian, I need to be extra careful.
No, it is. I'm not nitpicking.
I will say this. I used to work for an NGO that deals with the joint youth partnership in the educational sense in Jaffa and Tel Aviv. During my work there, we wrote a booklet stating the history, tracing the history of Jaffa under Israeli rule. Now, one of the most evident things that you see, especially in Jaffa, but it happens all over between the Jordan River and the sea, is this dynamic of, on one hand, now Jaffa is a city that has been, it was called the Bride of the Sea. It was the most cosmopolitan, intellectual center of Palestine under British rule and Ottoman rule, etc., etc., etc. After the 1948 war, 3,500 Palestinians only were left in Jaffa. That's over 95% of refugee population that left Jaffa. Jaffa was a city, the whole metropolitan was a city of almost 120,000 people. The next day after the occupation of Jaffa, 3,500 people. Now, this is the same for many places. Tiberias, Haifa had 3,000 people left, etc., etc. What you see that after the refugee population, Palestinian refugee population, which is also, a kind of a misleading term, because we're talking about Greek Orthodox, Armenian Christians, Maronites, etc., 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 left Jewish refugees and immigrants from both Muslim countries who deported many of the Jews living inside them after the 1948 war. Both Jews from Arab countries and from Balkan countries and from European countries post the Holocaust are coming inside, and they are being housed in the same houses of the Palestinian refugees. Now, you sit in front of this history, and for me, I'm completely speechless. What can I say? Can I call them usurpers? Can I call them thieves? People that had nothing entered the homes of people that were completely stripped from everything. It's a situation that finding a just solution in mind, looking at this history simply is crazy. But what you can say is that Israel, the state of Israel, the Zionist movement, using its institutional arms. Now, this is specifically, we're talking about public housing, but we can see it also in afforestation, for example, of Palestinian rural areas that many trees have been planted on, etc. Many, many, many institutional branches of the state of Israel are using the kind of social welfare, socialist dynamic that we used to have in order to enforce and to entrench and to become and make it harder and harder to solve the reality between Jews and Palestinians. Okay? And now, if we're talking about new processes, let's take the example of the neighborhood of Givat Amal in northern Tel Aviv. Givat Amal is formerly known as the village of Jamusin el-Gharbi, which was a Palestinian village. After 1948, the Palestinian population deported, fled, whatever you'd like to call it. After 1948, they housed there Jewish refugees from Morocco. And now they're building towers on top of that neighborhood and kicking out those Moroccan Jews that the state put there in the first place. Okay, and you see this dynamic coming again and again and again and again. And of course, you see it even greater in mostly Palestinian populated areas of inside 48. And this is, of course, not talking at all about what Israel is currently doing in the West Bank, forcing many farmers in the West Bank and other areas constantly away from their land, using what Israel likes to call illegal settlements. Every settlement is illegal, but in one hand we don't like the settlers, we call them illegal, but on the other hand the military is always making sure that they can do whatever they do. And so this is something that's still ongoing. I hope I was able to answer that.
Thank you very much, Yiggal. Sorry to have asked you such a difficult question.
Actually, if I could talk about this, it would be easier.
Sarah, go ahead.
Hi, so my name is Sarah, and I'm actually, I was really inspired by your story, and I'm really happy to be a part of this Zoom. And thank you so much, Professor Kent, for sharing with us this event, because it also allowed me to see one of my favorite professors, Professor Lear Libman, who was actually one of my first classes that allowed me to talk about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict from an unbiased perspective, growing up as a Muslim Arab in an Arab country in Egypt. I had almost like kind of a biased perspective, obviously, you know, free Palestine, you know, we gotta boycott Israeli products, stuff like that, different things. And I feel what you've brought to the table today in terms of, you know, seeing both sides of the story and really understanding what it's like to be a Palestinian and also what it's like to be a displaced Jewish person is very important. But what I wanted to ask you is a question about actually the IDF. Do you feel that there's a part of the IDF that's actually like, in a way, you know, not like, that doesn't involve hurting like Palestinians? Because one of my friends, she's actually Jewish, and her sister is really keen to go to the IDF. And I was like, how could you be keen to go to the IDF in a way? Because like, you know, it's very problematic. And, you know, like you said, your uniform says a lot. So I was just wondering.
يعطيكي ألف عافية سارة، شكرا على السؤال. As I said earlier, I think the equivalence you need to do in your head that I suggest that you might do is that of an 18-year-old American before going to college. Okay? For us, growing up here, we cannot, you know, the possibility of not going to the IDF is something that you receive either from your family, if you have people in your family who are critical, etc. And it costs not going to the IDF a lot of dealing with, you know, there is 50%, this is the written number, some say it's higher, 50% of those who need to go to the IDF don't go. Now, they don't go to the IDF, not because they're refusing or taking a political stance, because they need to work for the family. They feel it won't be good for them, speaking about their mental health, etc., etc., etc. And there are methods to do that. They're illegal methods, but there are methods. Now, in order to ask a normative, mainstream Jewish Israeli girl who wants to do good to her society, who wants to be part of her society, who wants to be able to speak up in her society. This is what I thought, that I won't be able to speak up, that no one would listen to me if I wouldn't go to the IDF. Now, the demand of not going is very, 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 very difficult. Of course, I can relate and understand and sympathize with the political base of that demand. But reality, of course, is much more complicated. Now, my advice in that sense, if you're close to that specific teenager, is to highlight those problematic parts, to speak about them, to make it part of the conversation. The decision, of course, like the same decision of being part of this kind of activity, the decision of going or not going, it's an individual decision that one needs to feel inside. But once it's inside the conversation, it is much easier to highlight. Especially with the historical, let's say, current in Israel, which the IDF slowly loses more and more of its public prestige. Okay? It is not a done deal, it is a long process, but this is what's happening now. I hope I was able to answer the question.
Yes, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
What other questions do people have? Go ahead, Nicholas.
Well, oh, sorry, everyone. I just wanted to first off thank you for coming here and just sharing your story. I really appreciate just hearing it and your openness. So just thank you for that. But my question is, you mentioned in one of your responses how it's so important not to be, sorry, how it's so important not to be a bystander. I was wondering how you think countries can best be allies and not be a bystander without veering into intervention, which we've seen numerous times is not really helpful to solving any issues. And I was wondering if there's any country's specific approach that you...
Nicholas, I'm sorry, I had some internet issues. They're okay now, but if you can start again. Sorry, I wasn't here for the most part.
Sorry. My question is about, you mentioned in one of your responses that it's important not to be a bystander. I was just wondering how you think countries and groups can best not be a bystander without veering into intervention, which we've seen is not really helpful in solving any of these issues. And if there's any specific approach by a country that you found particularly exemplary.
Yeah, that's a tricky question, but I'll try and answer it to the best of my ability. I think specifically, and this is what I know, so this is what I will say regarding the Palestinian cause or the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or the Zionist-Palestinian conflict will be more accurate to say. You have many, many, many ways to become involved, whether it is in student organizations that differ, have a political range, whether it is in off-campus organizations in the States, whether it is in initiatives that, put in front of them creating economic pressure, whether it is initiatives that put in front of them bringing Jews and Palestinians and Arabs together. The only thing you need to do is go online. Now, the question of effectivity, I think in any kind of social struggle or a fight towards justice, etc., is something that we cannot assess very well. I don't know if what we're doing is very effective. I know that if one of the students in the classrooms that I'm speaking is thinking that I might be right, then I did my share. Of course, my very small share. So in that sense, I'll just say, and I'm saying this with caution, and this is my own personal opinion, it is not the official stand of the parent circle, is that in the last term, in the last government we had, they founded an office, this government office, which is called the government to deal, translating freely, the strategic, no, you mean strategy, the office to deal with the strategic threats. This was founded by the Likud party, the Netanyahu's party. And basically, it is a very well-budgeted government branch, which their almost only job is to fight the BDS. Now that means that the Israeli nuclear superpower, regional nuclear superpower, is terrified by young activists who are taking a stand. That might be effective.
Well, while we're waiting for the, oh, there we go. Carrie, go ahead.
Hi, Yiggal. Thank you so much for speaking with us today. I asked a similar question to your father and Bassam earlier this week, and I'm curious to hear your response. One of the factors that that continues to cause our rifts and issues with building peace in the region relates to the way that the past, and especially memories of past atrocities, are activated in the present, whether that be with the Holocaust or the Nakba. In your work and when you speak to people, how do you advocate for remembering the past, acknowledging its very real impacts, but at the same time, not allowing it to be an obstacle in building peace in the present?
First of all, I agree with my father and Bassam completely, whatever they said. That's a starting point. Now I need to ask my dad to write me in the WhatsApp what he said, so we'll be compatible. I'll tell you this: my grandfather, Yitzhak, we said was an Auschwitz graduate. His honeymoon with my grandmother, who, by the way, grew up in the old city before 1948 and could cook beautifully all the cuisines around her neighborhood, which was Palestinian, Caucasian, Ashkenazi, etc. There's an example, almost living example. She passed away last year of this distant memory of life together. Their honeymoon was in Germany. They went to see Berlin. They went to see the Reichstag, the important German cultural heritages, you know. And I asked him at the point, how could you do that? He drove a Volkswagen. And he said, it's over. Now, I'm less, my grandfather was a good, forgiving Jew. Now I'm a little bit more angry than he was. I think I would have been less, easy with that kind of thing. But this comes to teach us that the person that's been through those atrocities, when given the chance to move on and to live his life well, this is what he does. And I think this is I'll say carefully, this will also could be the situation, God will, with the Palestinian Nakba in the 1948 war. Now, I wish for the day that sitting in a classroom in university and the opening statement would be like the one that Nadia did in the beginning of our session. If we'll sit in the University of Tel Aviv and people will say this university was built on the lands and on the physical homes of the village of Sheikh Mu'annis, which its inhabitants now live in, etc., 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 etc. Now, the road to correction, I believe, goes through that, and of course, through physical, proper financial reparations. And this is everything that I'm saying. Take it as, a suggestion from a Jew. let's leave the Palestinians away to agree on what kind of reparations is suitable. But what I'm saying is that this is possible. Many places around the world who are unfortunately been through atrocities in bigger numbers than the ones that we had here have moved past it and through it. Whatever is done is done. Of course, we need to acknowledge the past. We need to offer our forgiveness, offer our apologies and hope for forgiveness. But it happened. Now, Bassam, Arab's father, always says in lectures, if there's an Israeli embassy in Berlin and a German embassy in Tel Aviv, everything can happen. We did not kill 6 million Palestinians, and the Palestinians did not kill 6 million Jews. It's different. If this can happen, anything can happen. And I will take his words to answer that.
I'm going to go to Gregory next to recognize people who haven't yet asked a question.
Oh, hey, Yigal. Thank you so much for sharing your perspectives. They're really incredible and so interesting. I have a question just about to what extent in your education when you were growing up and just in society as a whole in Israel, like to what extent nationalism was taught in schools, and if at all that affected you or and just Zionism as well, if that it had an impact in your childhood or academic career.
Yeah, thanks. Now, I was never asked to stand up and recite the national anthem every morning in class. But of course it was taught, and of course it is more and more and more and more as the political reality is escalating and as the Ministry of Education is being handed to far-right nationalistic parties. Like the Jewish Home and etc. Now translating it makes it sound much worse. The Jewish Home. It's a party that the former Minister of Education, the former Minister of Education, was part of. Now, growing up, and I told you all about my radical parents that pissed me off completely when growing up. I became a very, very strong Zionist. My grandfather was a general in the 60s war. Before that, he fought in the 1948 war. My mother's grandfather signed the Declaration of Independence, what you can really call, Zionist. We have Zionist legacy, Zionist history, and I held on to that very, 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 very carefully. And I think it started to crack joining the military, realizing the different classes inside Israeli Jewish society, inside my own personal base. What I did in the army most of the time was I was a commander or an instructor of what you can call, the translation is the youth brigades, Gadna, Gdudei Noar. And these are 16-year-olds that come and simulate a week of basic training. Now, I was a commander, so I was the top of the base, etc. Of course, I wasn't a combatant, so in the military hierarchy, I'm even lower. But together with me were drivers and cooks and cleaners. And all of a sudden, I started seeing that I come from a certain descent, and my peers are coming from a certain descent, all European Jewish families. And the rest are coming from different parts of the world. I had the Georgian driver friend, I had the Moroccan Jewish cook friend. And I will share with you something else in that perspective of the de-Zionization of what happened. I was caught doing something I shouldn't have been doing. I was drinking on base together with the cook, the driver, etc., etc. And I was court-martialed. Now, the thing that the lieutenant colonel, which was head of whatever, said was not you were caught drinking, etc. You were caught drinking with them. Now that says everything, and that at the time told me everything. What should I think? What should I believe? Etc. And to get back to your question, which I completely answered a different question, is that it is very, very potent, and it is very, very, and it holds a great deal of the curricula being inside mainstream Jewish education. And that being said, you also have non-formal civic society kind of intellectual uprising of the Arab Jewish past. So these two things combined manage to level one another, sort of, but as the years go by and as the political system is shifting more and more to the right, national content and Zionist history and etc. is more and more part of the curricula. By the way, and this is to my remark at the beginning, I'm not sure it's much different than any other nation state. And again, I was never forced to sing the national anthem in class.
And I know you had your hand up sooner, but I'm going to go give student preference. So Sarah, you're up next.
So I just also had another question. So I think in the past year, more Arab countries started recognizing like Israel, and like not recognizing, but like making peace treaties. Like UAE is now like making, you know, like more, like just more acceptance of Israeli people, and trying to get like this whole like stigma around Israeli people out of the picture. And I know also Sudan did something, and like all these efforts. Do you think those are actually mending or helping the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or are they just furthering Israeli agenda, or which one is it? Or is it something else? I don't know.
I think we need to ask, first of all, I need to say, you know, a statement. These are not doing any kind of service. These accords are not doing any service to the Israel-Palestinian conflict. They're not doing any service to the relations between Jewish and Palestinians inside Israel and outside. But the world also has its own way to move things. Now, I'm not a prophet. I don't know what these accords will create. I am curious to see, you know, the view from the tower in Dubai. But I think this question, of course, it's very well put and intelligent, but I think it maybe could be premature, realizing what the effect will truly be in the region. I know that we have peace with Egypt. I haven't been to Iskandaria, I haven't been to Kahira, I haven't been to the places that I want to go in Egypt. And because it's difficult to get a visa, and maybe I'm not welcome, and maybe my country doesn't want me to go, etc., 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 etc. Now, there's a big difference between a peace accord and living together in peace like our region knew how a century ago. This we can say that we will see, but it does, and if I could say that, and I'm saying that carefully, it can indicate that the Arab world might have shifted a little bit in his stance towards Israel in the Middle East, and that probably means, and this is tragically forsaking a little bit the Palestinian agenda and cause. Now, what else will happen?
Yes. No, that makes perfect sense. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Ken.
I won't ask such a difficult question this time, but you referenced a couple of things, Yiggal, that I thought were really important, and that was that the Ministry Against Strategic Threats and BDS, which is boycott, divestment, and sanctions. And I'm sorry, I wanted to make sure we haven't had a chance to talk about that in our class yet. But I was curious if you could talk about some of how those two are engaging in some cases on either sides or multiple sides of this issue, how that's affecting your efforts, Autumn's efforts, and other things in terms of trying. Is it being characterized as selling out to BDS because your dialogue is normalcy, or is it and it's seen what you're doing as a strategic threat by the ministry? I just wanted to ask that. Thank you.
That's a great question, and thank you for asking it. First of all, I'll say that coming to the Zionist-Palestinian conflict or to the relations between Jews and Palestinians, everybody has a very strong stand. Everybody's sure what's right. Everybody's sure how we should lead our lives and what we should do with them, and etc., etc., etc. Now, a lesson in humility and humbleness to the world, in that respect, I think, is important. Now, as I said, I'm not opposed to BDS. I'm not opposed to sanctions. I think it was clear from what I said earlier. Telling you that this serves our specific work the best way it can, I'm not sure. The problem of normalization between the Arab world and especially in Palestinian society with Jews in Israel is a real thing. People are more and more afraid. This is why, again, our Palestinian counterparts and partners are so are so filling with inspiration, because they are facing criticism, which may be a just criticism regarding that sense of normalization. And every day that Palestinians are willing to continue and work with Israeli Jews is a day that I say thank you and God bless that this still happens. And I fear the day that it will not happen. For us, by the way, I'm not sure it serves them right, but for us, for Israeli society. That being said, and this is something, you know, apropos the humility and the humbleness that we talked about in the beginning, I don't know. This might work, this might not work. As long as something will move this almost, you know, it's the most difficult to imagine the end of this thing. As long as something will move us towards it, thank God that it happens. How it happened, what kind of prices we will need to pay, we will become like, I don't know, white population in South Africa after the boycott. Will it be the situation of the international seclusion, although it doesn't look like that, of Iran at the point that we become poorer and poorer and poorer, and I will not be able to speak at a conference in the United States, and et cetera, I don't know what the price we need to pay, but as long as there is an active, effective action against the occupation, against Israel's policy, if it manages to shift something, thank God. And unfortunately, Israel, with its policies, is proving once and again that this works. Why else would they have founded that office and gave it millions and millions of millions of budget to fight against, I don't know, 13 activists in the campus of UCLA? It's like they're imagining this kind of military, this organ. We're talking about activists my age, your age, you know, people that are speaking their mind. This, of course, are, you know, bad parts of the BDS and this marginal anti-Semitic kind of approach to it. We're not talking about that. I'm talking the mainstream leadership of the organization led by Barghouti and etc.
But I'm going to try and squeeze in one more question from Musab.
I have a follow-up question regarding BLS. At the risk of speaking for an entire group of people, what do Israelis, what are normal Israeli citizens' stance on BDS?
It's anti-Semitism. It comes to destroy us. It's fringe, it's weird, it's the reincarnation of the biggest, you know, threats to the Jewish people. And this is something that, again, what I said about the military and etc. If I could add a bit of, let's say, compassion to the stand, and I understand that fully. People that live their lives completely segregated from the problem that they have created. People that live their lives with not knowing, you know, most of the Israelis, I haven't done the statistics, but if I'll do them, I think about 90% of Israelis never been to the West Bank. Even a lower number spoke to Palestinians, etc., etc., etc. Now, this is not part of their everyday life. This is also one of the most horrific things about this occupation and conflict, that it doesn't touch us until it does, like the story of my family. But they think about people that support the BDS, that they are complete Jew haters, and that they are led by the same kind of motivation as the monsters in the past that did whatever they did to annihilate us. And, you know, collective memory and trauma is something that people have. You know, and they have all kinds of thoughts due to that. It's embedded in us. But we have a society here that grew up fearing this kind of now imaginary, it wasn't imaginary in the past, German boogeyman under our beds. This is the kind of mindset that, you know, everybody's coming for us and etc. until we got a state, they want to take the state. Now, in order to break that, and this is maybe something, it is, you know, a suggestion to BDS movements, etc. I don't know who am I to suggest such things, but if I can, is to create, not to give up on dialogue. There's a difference. There's a difference between speaking to the Israeli common man and woman, and there's a difference between speaking to the Ministry of Defense and to Elbit and to other corporations. You know, making a corporation defund their enterprises in Israel is not the same as speaking to your fellow student or to your peer. Yeah.
Thank you. That makes a lot of sense.
Yiggal, I want to be respectful of your time and everyone's time. This is your stories. We titled this week Stories of Loss and Reconciliation from the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict, but I really think beyond the stories of loss and reconciliation, they are stories of inspiration, stories of the power of storytelling, and the power of working together, so that joint activism that you spoke about so powerfully, I think is a really important takeaway for all of us from this conversation, for so many contexts, because there are conflicts in so many places that have parallel elements in the sense of, we don't know the other side. We only know this boogeyman image of the other side that we perpetuate through the narrative of institutions rather than the stories of people. So I really appreciate you taking time to share that with us and talk with us today. I'm sorry that Arab wasn't able to join us. Please give him our regards. Tell him that you represented him well. We looked at the video. We are standing in solidarity with all of you, and we're so appreciative of your work and your willingness to share it with us. So thank you so much. And thanks everyone for attending. Quick reminder, we do have a couple of wrap-up events tomorrow, which are really just kind of for debriefing. If you attended one or you attended all, please feel free to come join us for a little bit of reflections on what we've learned over the course of the week, how it's changing how we're thinking. And then after that, we'll have a short session. The first one at 11, reflections, and then at noon, if you want to know more about IGMAP activities and opportunities, you're welcome to join us for that. So thank you, everybody. I wish you all health and safety, and take care.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for listening.
Thanks, Rami, for joining us again. I want to know what teenager taught you how to use emojis so well.
I was so proud.
Self-taught, he's much better with emojis than I am.
Yeah, he's like 12 or something. He can type out entire sentences in emojis.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Nadia, especially. Thank you, Yiggal. Really appreciate you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
This was really fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Nadia, you wanted me to stay, right? We have the...
Yeah, you don't. I ended up recording this session. I initially had thought that I perhaps wasn't going to record the stories themselves and that I would ask you to recount them. But I think because I recorded this whole thing, we're fine.
Great. So thank you very much. Sorry for being so difficult to communicate with at the beginning, but it was a great